mute. How's that? You got me now?
Yep.
That's perfect.
Okay. Well, we're a little long, so let me be short, and maybe we'll get a little more time on the end because he'll have a lot to tell us. We've got another legendary speaker today. Farrell Guillory is a member of the North Carolina Media and Journalism Hall of Fame. He became a household name during his 25 years at the Raleigh News and Observer. Then for the next 25 years became a legend in the classroom at UNC. He is a professor of the practice who retired from the School of Journalism and Media this December after 5 decades as a newspaper journalist, policy strategist, and educator. From New Orleans, went on to get his master's degree in journalism at Columbia. He went back there from the New Orleans Times-Statesman to the Raleigh News Observer in 1972, and over the next 25 years brought Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism to the paper as a columnist, mainly on Southern politics and policy. You've probably seen him in The Economist, The New Republic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, 2 other publications, too much to name. After 25 years there, he came to UNC to teach at the UNC Huffman School of Journalism and Mass Media, turned it into the current world, co-founded the online publication Education NC that delivers news and policy analysis on education in North Carolina. Now, after 25 years, he may be retired. He retired in December, but he continues his work there and agreed to share with us today what we need to know about the changes in journalism and what we should do about it. So, Farrell, welcome today. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to have been invited and to talk to such a distinguished group. I want to get started in the spirit of Mr. Jenkins' notion that this is the wisest of Rotary clubs. You live in an academic community, so I thought we would start with philosophy here. So I reached back to Soren Kierkegaard, the distinguished, much read and studied and pondered over Danish philosopher of the first half of the 19th century. And so I'm going to quote Kierkegaard to get started. If the daily press were to hang out a sign like every other trade, it would have to read, "Here men are demoralized in the shortest possible time on the largest possible scale for the lowest possible price." If I were a father and had a daughter who was seduced, I should not despair over her. I would hope for her salvation. But if I had a son who became a journalist and continued to be one for 5 years, I would give him up. Well, I've been a journalist for more than 5 years, and I think I'm still on good terms with my family. But I can tell you, there are many more Kierkegaard quotes like that. He offered much more flaming rhetoric about the press than Donald Trump ever dreamed of. I don't know what was going on in Denmark back in the 1820s and 30s when he was writing, but it must have been something spectacular. So let me bring us into the 20th century and into the 21st century and offer a few general observations and then try to stir up some conversation and discussion. So I wrote a senior thesis in college. I graduated from Loyola University, New Orleans in 1969. And just before that, I wrote a paper on Walter Lippmann, who was a major public intellectual of the 20th century. And while hunkered down with COVID, I've had more time to read books, and I've spent some time revisiting Lippmann. And I read his early work called Liberty and the News. And let me read you a quote from that to get us focused on modern media. Insofar as those who purvey the news make of their own beliefs a higher law than truth, they are attacking the foundation of our constitutional system. There can be no higher law in journalism than to tell the truth and shame the devil. Now, Lippmann was writing in an earlier age, an age of newspapers and magazines, and his thinking was influenced by his concern, his fretting over the influence of propaganda during World War I. But his thinking on how to advance effective governance in a complex democratic society remains, to me, provocative and instructive to journalists and to citizens, to teachers and their students. He became known as the father of objective journalism, a concept much debated and misconstrued today. And it's emerged again as a hot topic in American journalism and in our contentious politics. So let me make some really kind of obvious but important observations. One is media are plural. That's correct grammar, even though you see it written, media is a lot. And media are changing. So it's correct grammar, but it's also correct reality, as it were. So it's hard to say the media does anything as a group. The media consists of a whole bunch of different kinds of publications, online, on television. I'm going to share a screen here if I can here. Will, you may need to help me out here. I don't have a share screen click.
It's not working. Just all right. I'll share my screen.
Yeah, go to the last frame. There you go. No, the one that looks like a pyramid.
Yeah. Oh,
What Will is clicking through is a PowerPoint that I used in my class last semester. I know this chart is hard to look at, but it makes the point of how plural the media are. This is a chart by this media consulting firm, and Media Bias. The horizontal tells you it goes from the far right to the far left. And then the perpendicular column is how much the news organization is devoted to fact finding and how much it's devoted to just speculation and commentary and even disinformation. And so the point of showing you this is to get across the point that media are plural, that there's a collection of major national organizations at the top of this pyramid devoted, at least to some extent, largely, I shouldn't say to some extent, I should say largely, to putting down facts, quoting people accurately, acting responsibly. There may be some tilt toward the right or tilt toward the left, but the what you might call the classic mainstream media that's at the top of this pyramid structure shares space and shares attention with a lot of other organizations that are much more opinionated, much more focused on their ideology as well as their journalism. Now, all of you know, of course, that the United States started with a press that was very partisan. The First Amendment was written not for the Associated Press, not for the New York Times, not for CNN, but a media ecosystem of that time of most newspapers were allied with a particular political party or faction. Okay, Will, you can take that one off now. I'm just-
I have may I interrupt? Just say, could you tell us of maybe the top 4 or 5 at the top there, because they're so small on my screen that I couldn't read what they were.
Yeah, well, there was the Associated Press was up there, NPR. It's hard to read, and I use it. Reuters, the news service, the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg is up near the top. Axios is near the top. It's a combination, but every one of you could take this group and do the chart in a different way. I don't want to argue that the chart is definitive. It's illustrative.
Good.
So let me, in the spirit of the personal minute, let me give you a minute of my background. One, to tell you how, to give you some sense of how the media has evolved, how there's been a constant transition through my career. So I left Columbia Graduate School of Journalism with a degree in 1970 and went back to New Orleans and worked for the States Item, the afternoon newspaper. Think of that. The name of the newspaper was States Item. It was the merger of 2 previous newspapers. The States Item no longer exists. It folded several decades ago, as many afternoon newspapers did. But what we lost in the demise of the States Item or the Raleigh Times or the Greensboro Record and other afternoon newspapers and local daily newspapers is that kind of personal touch, the service to a community. I spent about 6 months, really 6 boring months actually, in the sports department of the States Item. And one of my jobs was this was a really important job, was to get the results of the final horse race, the daily horse race at the fairgrounds, and get the results in the final edition of the paper that would go on the newsstand at 4 o'clock. And all the gamblers were gathered around to get that information. And a frequent visitor to the sports department in the States Item was this wonderful character named Black Cat Lacombe. And he came often to chat up the sports writers because he was one of the guys setting the betting line. And I tell you that not because betting and sports were the dominant feature, but that the newspaper was very devoted to its local community and trying to cover the local community. The States Item would send 3 reporters to a city council meeting to capture everything in real time to get in the daily newspaper. We moved to North Carolina in 1972. I was hired from out of state, hadn't been to Raleigh before, except for a job interview. I was hired, I think, in part because a previous political correspondent for the News Observer had gone to work for one of the candidates for governor. And it was at a time the News Observer was trying to show to its readers and to the political community that it could cover the news responsibly and fairly, and that it wasn't devoted to its old pro-democratic leanings, that the editorial page could be pro-democratic, but the news side was going to be responsible. I cooked up a project for the News Observer, which, thinking back on it, was pretty audacious of me and of the News Observer to fund me to do it. But I organized 3 reporters, Pat Stith, one of them, who went on to be a major investigative reporter, and Leslie Wayne, another, who went on to become a business correspondent for the New York Times. Well, the 3 of us fanned out across North Carolina in the middle of October 1972 to do an amazing thing, talk to voters in their own homes and in their own workplace, and to try to describe politics in North Carolina from the viewpoint of voters: door knocking, hard work, taking notes, listening to people, Well, I think Leslie went east, Pat went out to the mountains, and I was the Piedmont person. And in New Orleans, there was a standard feature that you'd ride a cab or rent a car. And so when I moved to Raleigh, I only owned one car, and my wife we had just had our second child. And I told the editor, I can't take a car for 2 or 3 days on the road and leave the family without transportation if one of the kids got sick. So they sent me to see Frank Daniels Jr., the publisher, to see what it could range. And Frank said, but we don't do that here. No one's ever asked about that. And I said, well, I'd like to do the assignment. So he reached into his pocket and he pulled out his keys and he said, here, take my car. So I did that assignment, driving the publisher's car for 3 days. That's the last time I drove the publisher's car. I think it convinced him that we needed a contract with a rental car agency after that. But again, I just tell you the story because of how much local and metropolitan newspapers were devoted to their community. And now we are unfortunately losing that because of lifestyle changes, technology changes, generational change. So here's kind of the big picture. In the era of Trump and of polarized politics and COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, national media have found means to sustain audiences and even thrive. The New York Times now reports it has more than 6.5 million subscribers, including more than 5.5 digital-only subscribers. In the last year alone, digital subscriptions to the Washington Post jumped 50% from 2 million to 3 million. And that's at a subscription price of $100 a year. The New York Times reported a few days ago that its digital revenue in 2020 for the first time surpassed its print revenue. Marty Barron, the just retiring editor of the Washington Post, gave a kind of an exit interview to the Atlantic last week, in which he said that the Washington Post now has 1,000 newsroom employees. That's up from about 550 just 6 or 7 years ago. The New York Times has 1,700 newsroom employees. Those of you who read the Post and the Times notice that stories that used to carry one byline now carry 3 or 4 reporter bylines. They double, triple, quadruple bylines. And yet in cities and towns across the country, including the Triangle, an alternative reality has played out. From 2008 to 2019, according to Pew, overall newsroom employment in the United States dropped by 23%, representing a loss of 27,000 jobs. Digital news employment, meanwhile, rose from about 7,500 to 16,000. It's nice that it rose, but it didn't offset the losses. My UNC journalism school colleague, Penny Abernathy, has influenced the national conversation over the future of journalism with her research on news deserts and ghost newspapers. With the pandemic and the recession accelerating local losses, she writes in her recent report, Expanding News Deserts, that 300 newspapers closed since 2018. Another 6,000 journalists employed by newspapers have vanished, and print newspaper circulation has declined by 5 million. What's also happening is a shift in ownership. You may have seen this week that the Chicago Tribune company was sold to a private equity firm. At the same time, the Baltimore Sun was announced that it was in the process of shifting to nonprofit status under the aegis of a Maryland owner. So what I want to say is, in the overall marketplace, Big media are thriving, metro and local media are struggling. And that has a profound effect on our democracy, both in terms of national democracy, but also in terms of state and local democracy. Now, let me mention a couple of other things, and then I could go on, but I really want to stimulate a conversation here. So, Marty Barron, in the whom I've just mentioned, is just leaving his role as editor of the Washington Post, gave a lecture at the Hussman School last fall, and he observed that the Trump presidency has sought to subvert the very idea of objective fact, and that the public's understanding about the role of the press in American democracy is eroding. There's clearly been what's widely called a Trump bump. Obviously, I say obviously, almost surely, the increase in subscriptions to the Post and the Times, the sorting of cable television news into MSNBC on one side and Fox and others on the other side, have a lot to do with the incendiary newsmaking nature of the Trump presidency. And we are, as a result, we are deep into into self-examination in the field of journalism, of what are our standards and how do we organize our language to reflect reality. And so whether it's the Trump presidency or the rise of social media, we're in a moment of another moment of transition and figuring things out. And we're in a moment of paradoxes of clashing impulses. So that many of our major news organizations are and continue to be owned by very rich people, billionaires. Billionaires own the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe. But also and major companies, big behemoth companies, own the entryways into the internet, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Google. And yet at the same time, the social media has opened up both avenues to misinformation and disinformation. In the media maelstrom today, misinformation and disinformation travel easily along with diverse journalism, academic research, and official documents. News literacy has become a major challenge for our school systems. And so let me stop. I know you want to ask some questions and put your own views in here. Let me end with this notion that in today's world, you can't rely just on one newspaper or one news organization, that shows up in your mailbox or on your driveway in the morning. You need to, we all need to take charge of our own media menu. The United States has as many as 500 online news sites. As Jim told you, I helped found one of them called Education NC, and that focuses on public schools and community colleges and HBCUs in North Carolina. And so I tell my students that they all need to have 5 or 6 relatively diverse media organizations that they read on a regular basis, that they consult. And I've tried to point them to, I taught a course last semester, well, a couple of, in the summer too, called fake news, polarized politics, and the 2020 elections. And I started off with with asking the students what did they read on a regular basis. Well, I was stunned to discover that about 5 or 6 of the freshmen, first-year students, read the Daily Mail on a regular basis, and I arched my eyebrows and was a little bit puzzled. What's the Daily Mail? And then I realized what they were reading was the scandal sheet from the UK, the Daily Mail, the tabloid that has a very aggressive online presence. And so it told me that I had a challenge to try to convert or nudge them towards more responsible professional journalism. And we all need to do our best to uphold and support responsible professional journalism in this media maelstrom that we have today. So it's according to my little laptop here, it's 1:55. So let me stop there and do whatever you'd like to do. Jim, are you going to moderate, or do I need to call on people? Or I'm willing to stay here as long as you'd like, but
we would love to entertain some questions. And so folks, we can use our usual protocol for that. If you would like, if you can raise your hand or you can chat your question, I'm happy to take questions as they come. Don't all speak at once.
I have a question.
Christy.
What impact do you see from groups like Report for America? I just became aware of them, I guess, during this past year and try to support them. As I understand, their purpose is to try to get reporters into news deserts and report on things that wouldn't otherwise be covered. Do you think they'll have much impact?
Well, I just wrote a recommendation letter for one of my students to join Report for America. For those of you that don't know, Report for America is relatively new. It's similar to Teach for America or Domestic Peace Corps, but it's for journalists. It's for young reporters to be supported by a nonprofit through philanthropy, to go to declining newspapers to help bolster the journalism. I think the News and Observer has 2 or 3 young people funded by Report for America. There's a lot of experimentation going on, a lot of stuff's happening. None of it's gelled. We don't know what the future is going to be, but outside of the major news, what I call big national media that remains very competitive, the local newspapers are much more about collaboration and about cooperation. So the News Observer, the Charlotte Observer, the Durham Herald, as most of you know, are now owned by a private equity firm, and they're much more alike than they're different. They share reporters, share editors. When I got to North Carolina, we were very competitive and we wanted to be ahead of the Charlotte Observer on breaking news. But the situation for metro and small town news is still relatively dire, except for a few lighthouse cases. But Report for America is among the dozens of new initiatives trying to fill the gaps that's been left by the collapse of advertising and the reporting and editing core of newspapers.
Diane Smith has a question.
Oops, I was muted. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. I spent a couple of years of my life working against media consolidation on Capitol Hill for Jim Goodman, which was an experience. And so
working for Jim Goodman is an experience in itself. Yes,
he definitely was. And for the folks that are left on the call, I thought it might be interesting. You just addressed the joint membership, media consolidation is just a concern without local ownership. And one of the examples that we always used on the Hill, because of course, Jesse Helms was someone of note on the Hill, was that the way that the reason that Goodman cared so much about stopping media consolidation was the example of his grandfather, A.J. Fletcher, did not like the editorials in the News and Observer because they leaned to the left. And so A.J. brought Jesse on to do editorials on WRAL. And so that to try to find balance in the community, which was certainly interesting to talk about on the Hill. But I wonder, I will always believe that Clear Channel destroyed radio. And then we've got lots of consolidation in in television. And now newspapers are kind of the last of the consolidation. So I just wanted your take on not just the big billionaire owners, but consolidation in general.
Well, as Penny Abernathy's research shows, there's been this huge consolidation on the newspaper side. I'm not as familiar, though I know about it, on the television side. I think when you add, the survey research shows that most people still say they get most of their news from local television, which makes me nervous because local television has a lot of weather and incidental crime and sports, and it doesn't go very deep. But I've got to say that having said that we in the Triangle area are fortunate that we have a major television station with local ownership that does produce some documentaries and discussions that wouldn't take place otherwise. There was a similar kind of local owner in New Orleans when I lived there, WDSU, and actually two owners, and they were competing, one at WWL, the CBS station, and WDSU, the network station. And I had to compete with those reporters for city government news in ways that I never had to compete with television reporters in Raleigh for state government news. And so local ownership matters even within the culture of 30-minute local news.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. I see that Roger Jennings has a question. Roger, are you on the call?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there seems to be a trend in journalism that seems pretty dangerous, and it was exemplified last fall when the Daily Tar Heel editor announced that objective reporting was no longer going to be the guiding principle for the paper. They're going to have a group of 19-year-olds interpret for us what the truth is, and of course that trickled down from the New York Times and the Washington Post, who have similar philosophies now. And I think it was all, the rationale was based on that Trump is too dangerous for us to simply report on him. We've got to interpret for you what his motives and all are. So my question is this what's being taught in the journalism schools today?
Well, just as media are plural, journalism schools are plural too. So I wouldn't argue that journalism schools are in lockstep about teaching anything. But let me say that the notion of objective journalism, of he said, she said, of balancing one side with the other, of what was known as the inverted pyramid style of writing, with the major news in the first paragraph and each successive paragraph was a step down, so that newspapers, whether they were leaned toward Republicans or leaned toward Democrats, could run stories from the Associated Press or the Reuters or UPI. that was a relatively short-lived 20th century phenomenon. There were strengths to that. There was a sense that those stories were credible, but there were limits to it. And let me go back to Lippmann and come more clearly to a work of elements of journalism that I use that I used in courses by Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel. They define objectivity, and so do I. This is the way I practice. Objectivity is not the outcome of a story, it's the process of developing news, so that you begin in a disinterested, independent framework, that you pursue the truth. You pursue different sides of the story. Most really important stories have more than two sides. It's more than he said, she said. But that the outcome doesn't necessarily need to be balanced, doesn't necessarily to be impartial. It needs to be responsible and explanatory and based on fact. I believe in what Lippmann called explained news. And I admit that that there can be a blurring of the line between objectivity and opinion as classically defined. But even before Trump's presidency, there was an increasing movement in American journalism toward more commentary, toward more perspective. And frankly, that's the kind of journalism I practiced for most of my career. As Jim told you, I was a columnist most of the time. I still write a column for Education NC. And so that's why I tell you that even as I acknowledge that we lose some of this sense of confidence that a story is being told, quote, straight, that we need informed professional journalism. I told my students that, and tried to stimulate a discussion with them with a provocative sentence that I'm going to give to you to tell you the dilemma here and the challenge. Most of the major reporters of our country, have reported misinformation, disinformation, lack of facts over the last 4 years, simply by quoting President Trump accurately. And the challenge for journalism that Trump, and before Trump, that that other crises in American history have uncovered, particularly the anti-communist crusades of the 1950s, is you can quote someone accurately, which is what objective journalism tells you to do. But if the quote itself is inaccurate, what do? And the Trump presidency pushed the New York Times and the Washington Post and other news organizations to confront that dilemma. And they came out on the side of they had to set the record straight. And that's what's going on in American journalism. How to do that in real time.
Isn't the way to do that is to get somebody with an opposite opinion and report both rather than the reporter taking a side. It seems to me like there's not much difference in what you're describing in terms of the way reporting is being done now, and that and propaganda. That's not news.
Well, here's the problem, and it is a challenge, and and what you're saying is weighing heavily on journalism right now. But
You need to what?
Shut them up.
Yeah, it's up to you.
But if a quote is demonstrably untrue, doesn't the journalist and the journalism organization itself have a responsibility to report what the facts are, not just go find someone else to say, well, that's not true and here's why, but that a professional journalist has some responsibility to say what the facts are. And so that's a lot of what American journalism is struggling with. I'm a believer in objectivity as a process. Objectivity means that journalists are not advocates. They're not partisans, but they pursue the news by talking to diverse sources, tapping into diverse sources of research, polling data, academic research, and helping people understand their society. Something beyond he said, she said.
Isn't that the problem, though, that most of the journalists today are advocates? They are partisans.
No, I don't. Well, there are a lot of journalists who are advocates and who are partisans. And that's why I say that's why I showed that chart was to show that there's a vast array of journalism being practiced, and that it's important for you. And I'm not speaking to you, Mr. Jennings. I mean, I'm sure you do this. You, as a general rule, ought to read and consult a variety of publications, watch a variety of television news, tap into different streams of thought. It's hard. We are all time limited in our lives, but one of my professors at Columbia once chastised me. He said, "Farrell, you're reading too many newspapers. Stop reading the newspaper and start reading more books and magazines and learn more." And it was good advice 50 years ago, and it remains good advice today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We're grateful for this, for your perspective, and we're grateful for this conversation. I think that's one of the great things about our group, is to have the opportunity to have a good conversation and to have good questions. So thank you for entertaining that, and we're grateful for you joining us today. Folks, thank you for being with us. I wish everybody a safe and happy weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.